I do some history of technology, so I always feel a kind of sense of obligation that it works somehow. Good morning. I should first explain that the plural in my title, the Autobiographies of Benjamin Franklin, is deliberate. I've edited the famous singular text now called the Autobiography of Benjamin Franklin, the Norton Critical Edition. But I also teach an undergraduate class that I call The 9 Lives of Benjamin Franklin, and tease students that they're not even getting the half of it with this cat-like take on Franklin. He was large, he contained multitudes. He, in fact, had more than one autobiography. That being the case, how might we think about his famous memoirs, in which he's a singular I, but also somehow a collaborative and civic we? I do want to stress the multiplicity of his selves, as seen most obviously in the wealth of pseudonyms that he used over his life, starting with Silence Dogood, the New England clergyman's widow with which Franklin launched his public writing career in his brother's Boston newspaper, the New England Current. And after that, Franklin deployed dozens more pseudonyms, probably more than we will ever be able to actually identify, running through, for instance, the Busybody, Antony Afterwit, Miss Polly Baker, a tradesman, a citizen, a lover of Britain, F.B., Homespun, the King of Prussia, Daylight, Twilight, Americanus, Bonhomme Richard, and ending with the last known of his aliases, Sidi Mohammed Ibrahim. Those are just the humans. Along the way, Franklin also wrote from the perspectives of a short-lived mayfly and his own tormenting condition, gout. Now, this appropriation of identities and names and points of view is colorful and fascinating, but doesn't necessarily inspire confidence that Franklin was always exactly who he said he was. His appropriation of some human identities distant from his own physical and cultural self is perhaps most troubling for us now, including the many women he briefly gives voice to, and then the Muslim slave trader, Sidi Mohammed Ibrahim, whom he invented to criticize the British and colonial trade in enslaved African people. Of course, now we'd wince or worse if a white man did this today. Then there are the two characters that Franklin inhabited more fully. The first, and maybe the most famous, maybe even more than Franklin himself, is Richard Saunders, the Poor Richard, who was Franklin's alter ego in his famous almanacs, representing him for more than 2 decades, from the age of 26 until just shy of his 50th birthday. Nor was Poor Richard forgotten even then. In the final almanac that Franklin produced in 1758, he rated the witty sayings he'd used throughout his almanacs to compose a final composite speech, later called The Way to Wealth, which carried Richard Saunders on to further fame, as with the naming of the Franco-American warship commanded by John Paul Jones, the Bonhomme Richard. So resonant a character was Richard Saunders that many people today still assume that his early to bed, early to rise, vernacular wisdom must somehow express what Franklin was really like, as if autobiographically expressed within his almanacs. And perhaps sometimes this is true. Except Poor Richard doesn't quite match the second of Franklin's most famous pre-memoir characters, this one being the Mr. Benjamin Franklin of Philadelphia, who wrote the Experiments and Observations on Electricity. First published in 1751, running through 5 editions in his lifetime, and translated into an ever-lengthening list of languages. So if Poor Richard was homespun and practical and locally famous, Mr. Franklin, the electrical demonstrator, was sophisticated and theoretical and internationally famous. Though, if anything, he was more embodied than Poor Richard, given how Franklin describes his electrical experiments in bodily terms, his own person. He describes how his hands, his fingers, thumb, and sometimes all of his body were sensory devices, as when he accidentally stuns himself senseless. Still, behind all this bodily business was a brain that used physical sensation to discover nature's forces. The embodied Franklin of his experiments and observations was individually discrete, a real person, but also universally applicable. Anyone can knock themselves out with a jolt of electricity. I'm just telling you, not recommending that, but it is still empirically true. And yet it was this scientific persona that made Franklin famous and influential enough to give him his consequential political career. That is the persona that carries him into what we now recognize today. Here he is consorting with Isaac Newton, who's the dim bust in the background as Franklin reads. This also made people want to know more about him. Once he was famous, his friends suggested that he write his memoirs, and just before the break between the colonies and Great Britain, he began to draft them. So the small exhibit for this meeting, which David Geary has set up, and thank you very much, David, for doing this. I hope everyone has a look at this. The exhibit focuses on items relating to Franklin's memoirs, including letters from two friends, Louis-Guillaume Leviard and William Vaughan, who plead with him to finish his memoirs. They believe that the story of his life showed how, in their era, it was more possible for more ordinary people to become notable successes in the extended public of letters, in public life, and just as an example of social uplift. But Franklin's memoirs aren't entirely clear about what person was being documented within them. It's, of course, a problem that they're not complete. Also, that Franklin never revised them, and that they were initially published without any authorization. Pirated, the autobiography first appeared in a French translation and without permission from Franklin's literary heir, his grandson, William Temple Franklin. The memoirs thus appeared under a slightly sketchy title, La Vie Privée, so the great man's private life, a phrasing that promises a kind of behind-the-scenes look, possibly a scandalous one, an expose, and a copy, shockingly, of this unauthorized edition is in this exhibit. This framing of Franklin's memoirs still referenced the grand person. You don't want to know about everyone's private life, but the famous, maybe. So the grand person that Franklin had become is documented and showcased after the 1-2 punch of his scientific and political careers. And eventually, when first published in English by William Temple Franklin, the memoirs appear among his other writings to identify him in relation to his other lives, including documents about the science and the politics, the Mr. or Dr. Franklin the public had first met in the experiments and observations. But in the 19th century, the memoirs, eventually called an autobiography, began to be understood as a narrative of social striving and betterment, either for ordinary folks to use as an inspiration or for their class superiors to use to scold them. The documents gathered in the exhibit show both these dimensions of the Italian, Japanese, and Chinese editions. Among them show this emphasis in different contexts as modern social divisions defined according to post-feudal economic systems became globally dominant and gave people a sense of where they might want to belong within this new network. But still, I return to the question of what version of Franklin did the author himself inscribe into his narrative, if we can think about it that way. This is the big question, relevant not only for Franklin, his life and times, his many lives and times, but also for how we think of autobiography in one of its first widely read modern examples. Franklin's account shows some debts to earlier and more often religious accounts of individuals who define their lives through moral accountability, often spiritual states visible to God. But Franklin's account is unsurprisingly much more secular, even though he identifies this model for himself. On the other hand, it doesn't have the narration of an internal consciousness and either stable or evolving personal self that would become hallmarks of modern life writing. So he is sort of between different kinds of models and aspirations. What comes across most strongly in his account are his belief in character and in improvement, both of them defined in relation to other people. So there is an I in this account, but there's always an audience. We are the eventual audience, but of course that was not his immediate sense of himself. Instead, he's acting out his life in relation to other people. I note that a much beloved part of Franklin's autobiography is the exception. This is a story of his running away as a 17-year-old to Philadelphia. And the exhibit here at the APS includes a very precious copy of Franklin's efforts to establish the basic timeline of his life, later in life trying to remember what happened when. And this one is about his escape from Boston and his arrival in Philadelphia on October 6, 1723, a 300-year anniversary coming up quite soon. This episode is held up as his effort to be free and independent and sort of qualitatively defining him, famous within these hallowed terms of the American experience. But pretty much all the rest of the narrative is about him rebinding himself to other people, to directing social energies and forging various kinds of social bonds. Again and again, he describes his actions and character in terms of doing harm or good to others. As when he defines his famous errata, the errors he admits he committed, like running away from his indentured obligations to his brother in Boston, and he defines how he might have erased those missteps, as, for instance, later helping his brother's widow and son. Within these terms, it's, of course, a problem that the account was never completed. Frankly, simply ended, describing some events of 1758, writing, "never put into execution," a phrase that lacks a period or any other punctuation. That's the end. As Franklin's health prevented him from continuing in 1790, the year that he died. So we will never know how, for instance, he might have described his evolution from enslaver to abolitionist. There isn't a hint in the text about he might have treated this important path of self-improvement and societal improvement, consequential in his era, resonating still in our own. Whatever the narrative's gaps, its emphasis on character is a very recognizably 18th century one, when personal character meant being credible, both for financial obligations but also personal ones. And here, the question of character intersects with the other contemporary concern, improvement, improving your own character, interacting with people in order to improve conditions so everyone can improve themselves. Franklin's autobiography is packed with good works, whether those that improved himself or improved societal circumstances. He sets out, for instance, his famous list of 13 virtues that he wanted to acquire. The 13th added when a Quaker friend admonished him to be humble, and so Franklin added humility, imitate Socrates and Jesus, thus proving his friend's very point. Equally ambitious were all the collaborative improvements that Franklin participated in or spearheaded out of a long list: a fire company, a library, a hospital, a learned society, in fact, this one. Some of these efforts might now seem questionable, as when Franklin helped set up a militia. That was a big step away from Pennsylvania's Quaker foundations in pacifism. But the overall project of improving things excellently conveys what Franklin really wanted to explain about himself, not least in his memoirs. His life and times. It's significant that within this, he used his many pseudonyms to do it as well. He made up fake people, but they had real points to make. Polly Baker calls out the double standard by which both men and women might have sex outside marriage, but only the women suffered the consequences. Daylight and Twilight were Franklin's alter egos when he wanted to critique British imperial policy, kind of depending on whether he thought things were getting better, lighter, or darker. Homespun recommends boycotts of British goods. The Mayfly mocks preening ambition. The Gout reproaches the greedy and the lazy, meaning Dr. Fatsides, meaning Dr. Franklin. I don't think I'll ever know who Benjamin Franklin really was. And the more I study him, the more I give up in terms of finding a stable internal self that we see evidence of. Certainly not, I can't discover this, however paradoxically, from studying his autobiography. If anything, that book is useful in telling us who we might want to be. The favorite story within it, of the young Franklin running away from home, lighting out for the territory, seems to many readers then to decline into a somewhat less gripping story of setting up all those civic organizations, as if the young outlaw is reduced to a life of committee work. Let's think of this instead as a rebel without a cause finding a wealth of causes to work for. His lonely I becomes an affirmative we. This is not only a good way of understanding Franklin, but of thinking about ourselves. The idea, let alone faith, that we can improve the world through public and civic action obviously has been taking quite a beating. But here we are in a learned society Franklin helped to set up not quite 300 years ago in a city he entered just about 300 years ago. The society's goal of promoting philosophy from its founding in 1743, and then of promoting useful knowledge, still connect to actual projects in the world. This tracks with how Franklin thought of his life's most important developments, as recorded in his memoirs, his vie privée, his autobiography. It reflects his history, his life and times, but also our continuing history and mission, the we that Franklin bequeathed to us. Thank you.
Thank you.